Good morning. My name is Ken Claiborne, and I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of this congregation. Welcome to all of you. The Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Elkhart is a welcoming community, encouraging religious freedom, nurturing individual spiritual and ethical growth, celebrating diversity, and promoting a just and sustainable world. If you'd like to learn more about this fellowship, please look at our website at uufe.org. And join us after the service for coffee hour through the gallery hallway into the gathering place. So that everyone might be able to listen and enjoy, please turn your phones off or to the vibrate mode. Also, if you need hearing support, please see the folks at the sound desk. We even have 2 new ones. So as we age, we had to buy more hearing aids. I have a few announcements. First of all, I'm up here because Lorna is ill today. I wanted to let everyone know that Lorna Lane is not feeling well. She's not here. Joan Claiborne's surgery is December 20th at the IU Med Center in Indy. We're leaving on the 18th. And we'll be gone for at least a week. The mitten tree back in the foyer is filling up. As you probably all noticed, it's looking pretty good. Steve will be delivering the material from that tree to the women's shelter on the 26th of December. So when you come for our evening service on the 24th, that'll be the last chance you have to add to the tree. Speaking of that service, rather than a Sunday morning service that day on the 24th, which is Christmas Eve, we will have a Sunday evening service starting at 6 p.m. with a cookie exchange, and the service will begin at 7. Does anyone else have any comments or announcements they'd like to make? I want to make sure and catch everything. Yes, Mary. I do. Yeah, but the only reason I forwarded that was for the information from. Yeah. Yes. Yes, very good. Yeah, I have that on my notes here, so I wasn't going to send you out of the room yet. Thank you. Thank you all. Oh, go ahead. Okay, the cups ritual for solstice will be the 23rd at 5 o'clock. And thank you all.
I'm not on the order of service, however, I'm supposed to speak, so I'm going to. I wanted to, I'm looking for Carol Lee Searles and for Emily Morrison. Anyway, I wanted to honor them and appreciate them for serving on the Arts Committee. They helped me hang the show out there, and I know it kind of looks like, oh, well, you just hang those things up there and get going. It takes us 2 or 3 hours to decide on the paintings and how they should be hung, and then to make sure everything is spaced appropriately and hung straightly. And we take great pleasure in making that happen, but it is hard work. And the other 2 members are in their 80s, so kudos to them. Well, maybe everybody can say thank you to them when you see them. Thank you.
Good morning. I've got a musing this morning, and I have to say, after actually doing one, they're hard because you're limited to a little bit of time, and I'm used to having all the time I want. So So here's Emily, and Carolee's coming. Well, you just got to thank you, and you weren't even in the room. So thank you. So I wonder has been prevalent in my mind lately. I wonder why, and I wonder what if, and I wonder who. You know what this is? I'll pass it around, and maybe later on you can tell me what you think it is. So, I've got a joke for you. I'm trying to start up my own business, recycling discarded chewing gum. But I'm struggling to get it off the ground. So, recycling, we try to do our best, or at least I do, we try to do our best to recycle. So I'm always questioning, is this recyclable? When I'm in the store and I'm looking at products, can I recycle that? Can I recycle this? And I found out recently I have some misconceptions. We had a gentleman from Recycling Works come to the school to talk to the kids, and we asked questions, and it was like, he kept answering, I kept going, really? So it's interesting because it kind of depends on where you live, what's recyclable. But if you live in Elkhart, and a lot of the surrounding areas send their recycling to Recycling Works, there's a lot of that's recyclable that I didn't think was. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But I wonder how much energy we use to recycle things. So it's kind of conundrum. You have to get the items to the recycling center, and that takes energy. You have to run the machinery that sorts, crushes, shreds, and processes the material that you want to recycle. Wouldn't it be better to keep things out of the landfill and the recycling center? So, but would that mean changing the way we do things? I wonder. Can we cut down on the amount of stuff we buy? Can we cut down on the number of trips we take? Could we hold church 3 Sundays a month and the 4th Sunday be a Zoom service? I got this checklist from the foyer. There's more out there if anybody. It's actions you can take to reduce your carbon footprint by the climate reality change. And going over the list, some of the things I'm already doing, some of the things wouldn't be that difficult, and some of it would be very inconvenient. So it cost me time, money, inconvenience to do some of the things on the list. I wonder. Some of them I already do, some I could do fairly easily, some of them would be inconvenient. Someone on NPR said, "We are prisoners of convenience." I wonder, what if we didn't have money? What would a moneyless society look like? It's hard to conceive because we're so used to the idea of money, spending money, saving money, making money. We choose to spend money or not to spend money. How could we function without money? Would it be a surprise to find out there's a moneylesssociety.com and a book entitled Moneyless Society by Matthew Holton? What if those people in Africa didn't need to harvest copper and other valuables from our old TVs and computers? What if they had their basic needs met without endangering their health? How would we get those electronics recycled? Would anyone choose to make that stuff if they couldn't make money off of it? Would we have to give up the junk we collect just because no one wanted to make it? I wonder. Would crime dry up without money? Would we be kinder to an environment if we didn't have to make profits? Indeed, if profits weren't even possible. I wonder. I wonder what workers would do. By the way, the thing you're passing around is laundry detergent. I got this at Meyer, a box of 50 sheets. And so this little cardboard box takes the place of the plastic jug. and the little sheets, of course. Now, it turns out, one of the things I found out from Mr. Zalea from Recycling Works is the plastic jugs are recyclable. I didn't think they were. Water bottles are recyclable. There are a lot of things, and I printed off a list, but it's pretty amazing. Even foil, I didn't think foil was recyclable, but it is. And he also stated pizza boxes with grease are recyclable, and it's nice if you rinse out your bottles and cans, but you don't have to. So, let's see, I'm not quite done yet. Let's see, where am I? Sorry, I lost my paper. What if we did without the things we don't really need? Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. I wonder.
We ring the gong 3 times. Once for those who came before us and made a place for us. Once for those who are here now. And once for those who will come after and build on the dream. In an act of unity and unbrokenness, whatever comes to your mind, will you please turn to number 448, and we're going to read the chalice lighting together. 448. 448. Everybody got it? Wait. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of the quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together. You don't have your order of, well, you do have an order of service this morning, and it's written there. Would you please read with me the unison covenant? Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This is our covenant. Okay, kids, you can go. It's great to see how many kids this morning. Stand if you're willing and able, and let's sing 168, One More Step. I assume Lizzie will play it all the way through. I'm not sure, but stand if you're willing and able. Step.
Our cash offering this morning will be shared with Church Community Services. And at this holiday time, let us reflect on how blessed we are to be able to give. Our morning offering will now be taken.
May get the hang of this eventually. This morning, I'm really privileged to have with us Rich Meyer, who is from Goshen. And he is here because I was alarmed when I heard about the war beginning in the Palestinian-Israeli territories. I immediately called the Christian Peacemakers in Chicago and asked them for a referral from this area because I knew from 25 years ago that there was a group in Goshen associated roughly at least with the college, or at least college students who participated. And they sent me to Richard. He is more than adequate to introduce himself after talking with him. He will tell us about his background and educate us further, and I hope bring more harmony to our community.
Thank you, Caroline, and for the invitation. That work? I think we're close enough. Okay. Talk right into it. Okay. Yeah, it's got a green light over here. I noted the statement of values, two statements of values from your website. The first, the covenant you repeated this morning, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This is our covenant. As a basis for a productive community, I like that. I think I was last in this building about 40 years ago for a memorial service for Jim Good, a friend of mine. He was working at that time for County Park Department, I think. The 7 principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association: inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion, acceptance of one another, encouragement of spiritual growth, free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and use of democratic process here and in society, with the goal world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the independent web of all existence of which we are a part. In contrast, the title I suggested, Whose Side Are You On?, points to unhelpful, simplistic assumptions and commits upfront to divisiveness. The question, whose side are you on? I'm afraid we've heard a little too much of that recently. It points to a default division of the world into us and them, with a strong implication that you'd better side with us, however this is defined, against them. Is that the rest of the universe or just the rest of humankind? The division of humanity into us and them ignores or violates 4 or 5 of the 6 principles of the 7 principles that guide the Unitarian Universalist Association. Whose side are you on? Does not suggest a free search for truth, does not start with acceptance of one another. The goal is something other than community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, or a common world of which we're all a part. It implies that some, the us or our side, are probably of more worth and dignity than them. Later this morning, I want to name some of the folks I've worked with in Israel and Palestine who embody an ethic of every human is of equal worth. I want to remind you all that these people are hard at work as peacemakers in the Middle East today. I want to explore the us against them worldview that seems to animate so much conflict. I have a theory I want to test with you later on that. But first, a little background about me and about CPT, which was Christian Peacemaker Teams until recently changed the name to Community Peacemaker Teams. And then a little about the long simmering conflict in Israel-Palestine that has again turned hot. I'm descended from Swiss-German Mennonites. My father's grandfather emigrated in 1871 to escape conscription in the Franco-Prussian War, and they settled in Ohio. Brenda and I were married in 1978, and we worked in Lesotho in Southern Africa with Mennonite Central Committee for 6 years prior to the end of apartheid in South Africa. And I think that gives me some of my perspective on the rest of my life. When we first purchased land in Elkhart County in 1988, I began to research the dispossession of the Potawatomi. This led to contacts with citizen Potawatomi Nation tribal members, then Prairie Band and Pokagon. I now believe that every settler descendant anywhere should be able to answer 3 questions about their home. Whose land was this prior to colonization? How did they lose it? And where are their descendants today? I'm on the board of the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association, and I've served as the navigator for 7 groups that have followed the Trail of Death from Indiana to Kansas. The next will be a seminary class in June, and I can tell you more about that if you're interested. Now, about Christian Peacemaker Teams, now Community Peacemaker Teams. It was formed in 1984 after a Pennsylvania Brethren in Christ pastor challenged the pacifism he observed in North American Christians, specifically Anabaptists. He compared the risks taken by soldiers and the training and the wealth invested by those who think that the solution to the problems is a good war. And what? Do those who think there is a better way, do we think peace will just spontaneously break out with no effort? He said, unless we are ready to take the same risks as soldiers, we have no right to call ourselves peacemakers. From that challenge, there grew an idea of a trained, disciplined peace force prepared to enter conflict situations. Part of the example cited was Witness for Peace, a mobilization of internationals for accompaniment in villages along the border between Honduras and Nicaragua, where the US-backed Contras were terrorizing civilians in the 1980s. Accompaniment, going with, an application, we sometimes say, of the grandmother effect. Would you do that if your grandmother were watching? And what if the observers have cameras and internet connections? I'll say another example was Peace Brigades International, which uses this model around the world since 1981. From 1996 until 2008, I was a reservist and then on staff for Christian Peacemaker Teams. I was a program coordinator for our team in Hebron al-Khalil. I spent most of my time in the West Bank, southern West Bank, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem, a few months every year. We were working daily with Israeli peace activists willing to go against IDF rules, willing to enter West Bank villages and meet with Palestinians, and with Palestinians willing to meet with them. Our role was often to assure each group that the others were coming to the meeting with integrity and goodwill. Among the Israeli groups, I have some here on the, I'll just mention these. I'll just read a list here of groups I mentioned, and I'm willing to talk more about any of these groups later. I'll just sort of list them here so you see the names. Rabbis for Human Rights, the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, that group and Bat Shalom are both led by women. B'Tselem, which is a group with lawyers at the heart. Checkpoint Watch, that would be often mothers of soldiers. Ta'ayush, an Arab-Israeli partnership. Zochrot. Zochrot is feminine plural for she remembers in Hebrew. It's the group of Israelis remembering the Nakba. Breaking the Silence, this is a group of former Israeli soldiers who now give tours of areas where they previously served as soldiers. I mentioned a couple is the Palestinian groups often were less organized as groups. They were more often shepherds and farmers and just people who had the poor fortune of living next to a settlement in the West Bank. But there were some Israeli Palestinian organized groups. Badil is a refugee rights organization. WeAm is the Palestinian Center for Conflict Resolution, does conflict management skills within the Palestinian community. I would highlight the work of Breaking the Silence. You can get an interview by Ori Givati, a former Israeli tank commander, who is a member of Breaking the Silence, on the increase in settler violence in the West Bank since the outbreak of this war. A 7-minute clip of him being interviewed is on NPR from November 14. Our teams also reported on barriers for children going to school, another of many forms of harassment designed to make life miserable and encourage emigration. The Israeli peace groups consistently challenge attempts to define all opposition to Israeli government policies as anti-Semitic. And I'll just say the definitions of anti-Semitism or Zionism, or for that matter, racism, are all too varied and contested to make it even possible to evaluate statements like Zionism is racism or anti-Semitism is anti-Semitic. It is pointless to debate those statements. And what would it mean to win that kind of debate? The definition of genocide, likewise, is a subject of intractable debate. The Wikipedia article on genocide prints out at 38 pages. Just last week, a member of Congress in the US said that, quote, the use of the term intifada in the context of the Israeli-Arab conflict is indeed a call for violent and armed resistance against the state of Israel, including violence against civilians and the genocide of Jews. Well, that's ridiculous. Intifada does not imply genocide. It translates as shaking off, and it has meant resistance to occupation for about 34 years. But there's a line in Humpty Dumpty that says, well, you can make a word say whatever you want it to. At the same time, an Israeli peace group recently called on the international community to hold Israel accountable for decades of genocidal colonization. Okay, it's easy to bandy about inflammatory terms, but I think it's a distraction. The effects of actions by people on other people, these are real. Labeling those acts is a legalistic scorekeeping exercise. Consider how language has different impact depending on the power position of the speaker. There are passages in the Bible that, in my view, were written to give comfort and encouragement to a small, weak tribe caught between and sometimes under powerful empires. when those same words are now claimed by white American Christian nationalists speaking from a military superpower, they have a very different triumphalistic sound. Or another example, when civil rights activists sang "We Shall Overcome" in 1965 in Selma while being attacked by police dogs, that has a very different meaning than if it's yelled by white supremacists marching through Charlottesville in 2017 carrying torches. We have to give some attention to the fact that a sentence spoken by an oppressed person yearning for liberation does not mean the same thing as the same sentence from a member of a dominant group. For example, the phrase "from the river to the sea" originated as an early Zionist slogan describing the extent of Greater Israel, their dream. In 1977, an election manifesto by the Israeli political party Likud stated that, quote, "between the sea and the Jordan, there will be only Israeli sovereignty." Today, Likud, Netanyahu's party, is in power and has prevented any progress toward a two-state solution for decades, preferring creeping annexation. But now US college presidents are being told they have to shut down chants of "from the river to the sea" by pro-Palestinian activists. It depends who's speaking. I'm not going to do a history lecture. There's way too much history. The Ottoman Empire to 1918, the British Mandate to 1948, both involving the entire real estate in the area. The State of Israel declared in 1948, with refugees fleeing to the West Bank, to Jordan, to Gaza. In 1949, the nations of the world, in some reaction to what had happened with the temptations of empires in the world wars, affirmed the Fourth Geneva Convention. If you're not familiar with the Geneva Conventions, the first one covered the rights of shipwrecked sailors in a war. The Fourth Geneva Convention, relative to, I think I put the name of it up here, relative to the protection of civilians in time of war, this international agreement, the Fourth Geneva Convention, is where we get the term occupation. What the Fourth Geneva Convention said is that from here on, it will not be okay to move the boundaries of a nation through war. You can't send your tanks across the border and claim territory. Instead of annexation, or instead of moving boundaries, the perception was this opportunity to move boundaries through war was a temptation that would result in unending war of people trying to claim more land. So the agreement of the nations of the world was, if one country takes control of territory across the border, that becomes occupied territory. And the occupying power has all kinds of obligations. They have to keep the schools running, the hospitals running, the postal service running. They have to keep track of every prisoner in every jail. These are the obligations of an occupying power. Now, you may remember the US became an occupying power in Iraq. And that, I mean, okay, it looks easy. You send in the troops and you take control, but then you are the occupying power and you're responsible for maintaining everything that goes on. And according to the Fourth Geneva Convention, you're not allowed to annex anything, and you're not allowed to colonize or send in settlers. That's against the Fourth Geneva Convention. There are a number of ways in which the Fourth Geneva Convention is the problem that Israeli settlers are dealing with all the time. That the Fourth Geneva Convention simply says, no, you can't do that. This is occupied territory. Eventually, you're going to have to end the occupation. And in the meantime, you're responsible for everything that goes on in the area you control. Now, about us, them thinking. Here's my theory. You can test it. I believe it's part of an infant's early learning and a result of natural selection to recognize family and kin as caregivers and to view others with suspicion. That is, I think it is natural for a child, an infant. Neuroscience tells us that at 8 months of age, a child can prefer one face of someone they don't know to another. They can make a preference. What is that based on? Probably mostly on how similar it is to their earliest first caregivers, the person who takes care of them and feeds them. I think it is natural for a child to divide the world into us and them. But as the child grows older, when they're introduced to others who also care for them, their us category expands and them shrinks. This may continue as a process of maturity and development to include people who are different in more ways, different in language, different in skin color. All who were previously them can become part of us if our experience supports this. I think it is a maturing process for our us to grow larger and for them to become a smaller and smaller category. However, this process can be interrupted by the teaching of racism or ethnocentrism or nationalism, where an impressionable person is told not to trust them, or through trauma, through traumatic experiences. So I believe the process of growing and maturing and of trauma healing is a larger us and a smaller them. But as a simple exercise, should we try to just name a few of the traumatic experiences of Israelis and Palestinians over the last century? What would you name as traumas experienced by one group or the other? Yes. The Holocaust, preceded by centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. I brought a couple books on that. This is sort of the textbook, The Roots of Christian Anti-Semitism. And this is a book by a CPTer, We Are the Pharisees, about, again, Christian anti-Semitism. How else was that expressed over the last centuries or millennia? The Crusades, pogroms in Eastern Europe. Around the time of World War II, the rejection of Jewish refugees by many Western countries, including the US and Canada. For Palestinians, a century of loss of Zionist immigration. In 1917, Britain declaring that somehow Her Majesty's government viewed with favor the emigration of large numbers of Jews to establish a Jewish state somewhere else out of Europe. The area was carved up after World War I and ruled very poorly by the British for a couple decades. Then there were partition plans that gave an exceptionally large part of the land for a Jewish state relative to the population. And then there was the Nakba, or the independence of Israel in 1948, 1967, the beginning of occupation, and apartheid. Life in the occupied territories meets the definition. Different laws for different people in the same location based only on group identity. But as I said, it is not the label, it is the lived experience that's a reality. So 2 observations. First, nothing that happens in a long conflict can ever be described as unprovoked. Every violent act now is more accurately described as retaliation, ongoing, continuous, reciprocal cycles of retaliation. I'll just say the most poorly informed commentaries I've heard on October 7 refer to it as unprovoked. Well, that's ridiculous. Every violent act is a retaliation at this point. And often, perhaps not the fault of the victim of the lashing out, they just happen to be there. And second, there is an awful lot of trauma that needs to be addressed and cared for and healed in that part of the world. So now what? I have a quote from General David Petraeus, who was in charge of the US occupation in Iraq in 2008. he said, and this is probably not referred to often enough, we cannot kill our way out of this. That's an interesting observation for a professional soldier. But when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So there is currently a couple on the east coast of the US, not married, but just traveling together, a Palestinian woman and a Jewish man on an East Coast speaking tour for peace. And they begin always by saying, well, the starting point is no one is going to leave. Drop that fantasy, work from reality. And the fantasy of getting rid of the other is common. A second fantasy, I think I have here a drawing of a triangle. Jeff Halper, who is an Israeli Jew, he actually came from the US. He always claims he was at Bob Dylan's bar mitzvah in Minnesota. Jeff Halper says, this is the permanent problem facing Israelis. On this triangle, there is the land, there is democracy, and there is Jewishness. And he says, to create the state, you can choose any two. Take your pick. You can't have all three. You cannot have a democratic Jewish state on all the land. That would include 7 million Arabs. You can have all the land in a Jewish state if you're willing to give up on democracy. You can have a Jewish democracy if you're willing to give up some of the land. That is generally the approach of people who say we support a two-state solution. The two-state solution means give up some of the land so that you can have a democratic Jewish state that would be Israel. Or you can have all the land and have democracy if you are willing to have a secular democracy that isn't specifically Jewish. The problem, in part, is that US foreign policy and Israeli government policy for many years has been to encourage the fantasy that somehow you can have it all. A third fantasy, again challenged by events, was again promoted by US policy over the last 2 decades, is the fantasy that Palestinians can be ignored. That with enough force, Israelis can live in comfort and security while Palestinians suffer in subjugation. US policy has promoted that fantasy, and I'll just say October 7 was, if anything, a simple reminder that that is not possible. So now what? We don't have to actually decide what will happen there next. There are people advocating strongly for a two-state solution. I think one of the problems you have to look at is that you're really proposing two apartheid, discriminatory, exclusive ethno-states. There are people calling for a one-state solution. Generally, a secular democracy is what's called for. There's a proposal out there for a 4-state solution. Allow one state for a theocratic state for the ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities that don't want democracy, allow a Jewish secular state, allow a Palestinian secular state, and an Islamic state. So that would take 4. But that would represent more of the people who have different ideas of what they want. The two-state solution has received lip service from Israeli governments and US governments for 30 years, but many say it's no longer a possibility, that too many settlements in the West Bank, too many, and it's not clear there's ever been a solid majority in either Israel or the occupied territories for the two-state solution. Those most adamant that it has to be 2 states, not one, are those who want a democratic Jewish state. They would give up land but then they would have to find a way to exclude non-Jews from their state. Tom Friedman, writing in the New York Times, is in this category. One week he points out the complexity of identities and relationships. I listed some of the ones he has in one of his articles. The mix of Palestinian and Israeli life is profound. They are often living together. But the next week, Tom Friedman insists we have to have a two-state solution. But would either state allow citizens of the other to live there permanently with what rights? If not 2 states, 3, 4? I advocate for treating humans as humans with respect and honesty. Dehumanization is wrong and destructive. The golden rule is stated in the affirmative or the negative by 20 world religions and several humanistic traditions. The laws of war, or the just war theory, set a pitifully low expectation of limits to brutality, and at a basic level, they contradict the logic of war and violence, which is to win. By even the minimal standards of the laws of war, the Hamas attack on October 7 was a war crime, and the Israeli massacre of Gazans since is also a war crime. No one should be asked to defend either. Both are horrible atrocities. So I encourage you to stick with the UU principles: inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion, acceptance of one another, encouragement of spiritual growth. I think that has to include accepting the reality of diversity of faith families, and as you do. Any theocratic claim is a preparation for discrimination. So stick with that. You do not need to choose to side with one nationality. You can side with people and try to find support any who are on the human side. There are on the scene both Jewish Israelis and Palestinians who are doing this with passion, conviction, celebrating their common humanity, challenging tribalism. I'm going to side with the peacemakers. I'm going to end with one more picture here. Again, back to the question, whose side are you on? The common implication of that question is, here are Israelis and here are Palestinians, and you need to choose a side. But I'm going to say there are, in fact, Israeli peacemakers, and there are, in fact, Palestinian peacemakers. And there are, in each ethnic group, war makers. There are Israeli war makers, there are Palestinian war makers. I define that as someone who believes that the best way to get to the future we really want is through a good war. And the peacemakers believe that actually the way to get to the future we want is by finding common ground and building peace. The Israeli and Palestinian peacemakers practically do work together. I gave you a list of some of the groups that are doing that every day. The war makers are working together in a very pragmatic sense without ever meeting each other by continuing to escalate violence. And that's really what it takes, because their goal is not an immediate military victory. It is to convince this big group in the middle that they are right and to side with them. So the war makers' true first goal is to convince the vast middle ground to join them, give up on peace, and accept the fact that a war is the way to the future. The peacemakers, by working together, are actually trying to do the same thing. They're trying to convince the large group in the middle that there is a possibility for living together in peace. And they demonstrate it by what they do. So when you are asked whose side you're on, my suggestion is that's the side to choose. Thank you. So you have a chance. Chuck, you're coming up here? Yes. Okay.
I hope I'm on. Good. Let's have some quick talk back.
With your experience in the war zones, et cetera, physically in the Gaza Strip, in Israel, what's your assessment of all the chaos on the university campuses in America in terms of getting a handle, and do they even have a clue that peace is trying to be, it's like they're clueless in this country of what's going on.
So because of a lack of lived experience, because of not really, I'll say, and partly because of the fact that most Americans are not familiar with any of these groups. I mean, maybe some of you would be able to name 2 or 3 of those and describe what they're doing, but these are the unsung heroes of the peace movement. And if you are not aware of this group, or if you're not aware that there is in fact a group of a side you can choose of the peacemakers, then you're left with this us-them thing where everything is scorekeeping. And my sense of what's going on the college campuses is that it's scorekeeping right now. It's people trying to figure out, did I hear more statements in this group or at this place that supported Israelis or that supported Palestinian rights? And I think in the broader political sense, we're facing the fact that there is a younger generation coming up that has more sympathy for Palestinian rights and their experience of occupation than for the earlier and more distant traumas of the Jewish people. I'll just say Israel has been a powerful force in the Middle East for a number of years, and the young people today do not connect in terms of their experience with the Israeli traumas of the past. They see Israelis as more powerful, and they connect more with the experience of Palestinians as victims of colonization. So what we're seeing is a generational shift in sympathy. And if you're doing scorekeeping, that worries you. I'm not much impressed by the scorekeeping approach.
Will you please give me a brief explanation of how Hamas is related to or different than the Palestinians?
Yeah. So when the US dropped a nuclear bomb in Japan, how many Americans had any say in that decision? No, I think it was probably 30 or 40. Yeah. I mean, it was not 0. But if you then have a newspaper headline that says, America drops the nuclear weapon on Hiroshima, well, okay, that's assigning responsibility to 150 million people at that time, when 40 adults made the decision. Palestinians, for the most part, are not Hamas. Hamas is a small militant group that does reject Israel's establishment of a state in what they see as Palestinian territory. They have people in the Palestinian community who appreciate the fact that they are resisting. There are also many, many Palestinians. One of the groups I didn't mention here are healthcare workers. If you go to any hospital in Israel or Palestine, you find people who are committed to taking care of any injured person who comes in the door. Now, so what happens if the Hamas militants do, as they do, hide among a civilian population? Well, according to the Israelis, that's a terrible violation of the rules of war. Soldiers should wear uniforms and be out in the open where you can find them. And then they should be accountable through a chain of command. Well, it turns out that's not how a guerrilla force can fight. And it's a ridiculous expectation. So the Hamas fighters are, in fact, violating the laws of war on a daily basis. They don't represent the Palestinian people any more than the decision to drop a bomb on Nagasaki represented you. But in the newspaper headlines, it will put them all together. France objects to US such and such. Well, how many French people does that represent? I mean, the French government, okay, objected to something we did. I think this business of trying to remember that in most populations, there is as much diversity as this, where there are people who have decided that the best way for us to get the future we want is a good war. Now, part of the definition of a good war is one we win. But that is a part of the population, but it is not the majority.
Yes, I have two quick questions. One of them is, how do you see this finally playing out? Will it, in your opinion, expand? It already has expanded to our campuses in some respects. Do you envision this being such a polarizing thing that it's going to create wars outside those borders?
My record of predicting the future is pretty poor. And I think I said that in my view, them thinking is a result of trauma primarily. Some experience, a traumatic experience, causes people to be afraid of something that looks like what might have hurt them. What we have right now is just cascading, Niagara Falls of trauma being dumped on both Israelis and Palestinians. So what I see is probably less chance of negotiated settlements for the rest of my life than there has been in the past. In a certain sense, if you tried to chart, the odds of a peaceful resolution of some sort, and any forcefully imposed solution is by definition not lasting. I would say the odds were probably highest when Arafat and Shimon Peres shook hands. And then Peres was assassinated by an Israeli extremist 6 months later, and Netanyahu replaced him. And now we've had 30 years of Netanyahu, which mostly has allowed continued annexation by settlements and resistance to what would have allowed a two-state solution. I mean, very specifically, Israel supported the growth of Hamas as a way to weaken the Palestinian Authority so that they could continue to say, we have no partner for peace. And to a certain extent, for Israeli government officials who would rather not have peace, Hamas is a gift and one they worked for. So where are we now? I'm going to be glum and pessimistic. I'll just say, I think the odds of a peaceful resolution have dropped. There is some kind of an opportunity at the end of a war, and this war will end. I think this war will end after Netanyahu loses power, probably, because at this point, I think Netanyahu sees the end of the war as meaning he might have to go to jail for corruption trials. But in the meantime, what I look for are the people who are still, these groups that are still look up some of those groups. That could give you some sense of hope. They're out there, they exist, they're working. And after the trauma, they'll keep working.
I'm going to give Mary the last word.
I found your statement that people that were more interested in peace than war needed to take as much risk as the military. that was an electrifying statement for me as a former Mennonite. And I think there's a lot of value of that. I know about the conscientious objectors going as medics, but I had never really thought of an entire army of peacekeepers going in and trying to find common ground in places. I just think that's an amazing idea, but it would take a lot of organization to get that many people to go and do it.
We peacemakers have been too passive. I mean, that's
Yeah, I just want to pray for them, you know?
the war. Yeah, the war makers put tremendous effort into making a good war and take risks, and some of them never come home. And that's the kind of effort we put into wars. We do not put nearly that effort into peace. That's a tragedy.
Thank you so much, Rich, for coming and speaking to us and giving us your valuable insight.
There's a big difference between peacemakers and peace wishers. Every week we gather in this beautiful space to find peace. Each week, words and music offer and celebrate peace with the hope of instilling it in us. Now take the peace you have found here back out into the world with you. Renewed in our faith and inspired to act, let us be the peacemakers the world aches for. And by being peacemakers, let us find the peace that we long for. Go in peace, make peace, be at peace. Amen.